All right. Claim number 6 in the spirit of the upcoming holiday.
Yes.
The Christmas star was a
Mhm.
comet or constellation of planets.
Okay, this is a fun one for me. And I have to say, I do like talking about this at Christmas time because you're going to run into all these documentaries on television. People are going to say, yeah, well, we know exactly when Jesus was born because we can point to, I don't know, something like some particular cosmic alignment. And this is what's going on here. Now, I just have to, shameless plug. I already mentioned my historical Jesus book, but shameless plug. I do have a book out called The True Meaning of Christmas, The Birth of Jesus and the Origins of the Season, has a foreword by patristic scholar John Cavadini at University of Notre Dame. And in that book, I talk about this a bit more extensively. So this is just going to be a kind of shortened version of it. By the way, this book, it was a lot of fun to write. It starts with, every chapter starts with a Christmas song. And then I kind of go out of that into some other topics. So anyway, hope you'll check it out. But let's talk about this issue of the Christmas star. Is it some kind of comet? Is it Halley's Comet? What's going on here? All right, so let's take a look at Matthew's gospel, because once again, it really helps to, this is crazy, it helps to actually read the gospel story. So many people don't read the gospel stories close enough when they think about Christmas and other things. All right, here we go. The Magi come and they say, for we saw his star at its rising and have come to worship him. When they had heard the king, they set out. And there ahead of them went the star that they had seen at its rising until it stopped over the place where the child was. You know, as stars do. You know, stars kind of move in the sky and then they show you what house you're supposed to go to by settling over them. Swan, I promise you, if I ever have the opportunity to have you over to my house, I think in the 3 years, SBL will be in Denver. Hopefully you'll come to Denver. Maybe you can meet my family. We'll have you over to the house. But I promise you, if I invite you to the house, I will not say, Swan, here's how you get to the house. Look for this particular star. It's the house under that star.
Mm-hmm.
That's insane. You cannot find a house by looking at a star, right?
Mm.
So the star they saw is at his right. It stopped over the place where the child was. And when they saw, we read, nope. When they saw the star had stopped, they were overwhelmed with joy.
Mm.
So is this some kind of constellation? Not according to the church fathers.
Mm.
Right? Let's look at St. John Chrysostom. For you know that a spot of such small dimensions, right, house, right, could not possibly be marked out by a star. For by reasons of its immense height, it could not, I love how he's explicitly saying what I just said, right? But like being very, very technical about this. For by means of its immense height, it could not sufficiently distinguish, so confine the spot and reveal it to those who, did I lose to, what's going on here? Reveal it to those who were desiring to see it. How then, tell me, did the star point out a spot so confined? Just the space of a manger and shed, unless it left that height and came down and stood over the very head of the child. So the tradition is that it's not just that they looked up into the star and they saw any star in the firmament, but the star actually came down, because how else would you know which place you're supposed to go to unless it descended in some way? So there's a great book, I highly recommend it, written by my favorite gospel scholar in the New Testament and New Testament studies, biblical studies, Dale Allison. Dale Allison has this book, Studies in Matthew, Interpretation Past and Present. He has a fantastic article on the star. One of the great things about Dale Allison is he's not just an incredibly gifted scholar who knows the languages, he knows the historical context, he knows contemporary scholarship. He also reads the fathers. He reads medieval writers. He reads older scholars, which is something that I get frustrated and a lot of people today don't do. And what he says in this chapter here is that for ancient Jewish sources, angels and stars go together. And you can see that in the book of Daniel. You can see this in other places where angels are described as stars. Think of the book of Revelation. In the book of Revelation, Jesus is holding in his hand 7 stars, and then he later says, these are the 7 angels. Stars and angels go together, and that's even true today. What do you put at the top of your Christmas tree? A star or an angel, right? And so in the Gospel of Luke, who is it that heralds the birth of the Messiah? Angels. And so for church fathers, the star in the Gospel of Matthew is actually the work or a manifestation of angelic activity. That's the tradition of the church, right? It's not that there was Halley's Comet or something like that. There's much more support for the angelic interpretation here.
Right. It's not that Michael Barber is denying the possibility of miracles in his, postmodern age. And no, it's like even the church fathers recognize that there's another interpretation here than a kind of like literal comet in the sky or something like that.
Right. I'm very much open to miracles. I'm very much open to miracles. But we just have to read the text carefully. And stars don't act like what it sounds like happens in the Gospel of Matthew.
Right.
I can't give you directions to my house by pointing out a star in the sky. It's just not going to work.
All right. Claim number 7.
Yes.
In the Gospels, Jesus is born in a stable.
Yes. So the crutch that we are familiar with, the manger scene, that really goes back to Francis of Assisi, right? But let's look at the account of Jesus's birth in the Gospel of Luke. Of course, different accounts, Gospel of Matthew, Gospel of Luke. We don't have magi in Luke. We don't have shepherds in Matthew. But in the Gospel of Luke, we have this very interesting verse, right, that gets cited a lot. And Mary gave birth to her firstborn son and wrapped him in swaddling clothes. And she laid him in a manger. The Greek word there is phatne, as Raymond Brown points out in his book, Birth of the Messiah. This is most likely a feeding box of some kind. Right? She laid him in a manger because there was, now this is the King James Version. This is what most people know. She laid him in a manger because there was no room for them in the inn. Now, when people hear that, they, I think, have a misunderstanding of what's going on here. There was no room in the inn. So it's like no room. It's like Joseph goes in and he says to the guy behind the desk, got any rooms available? And there's no room in Hotel Bethlehem. I think people imagine that John the Baptist or Joseph is going into Hotel Bethlehem. There's like a no vacancy sign. That's not what's going on here. So what does it mean there's no room in the inn? Well, the word that's used there for inn is really important, right? It's not the word that appears later on in the story of the Good Samaritan. Remember the story of the Good Samaritan? He finds the man who's beaten by the side of the road. He takes him to an inn, and he tells the innkeeper to take care of him, and he will pay him back whatever costs were involved the next time he comes through, right? That word there is pandokion, right? So there's a great article by Stephen Carlson, a New Testament scholar, who looks at what is going on here in the story. And oftentimes, I think when we hear the story, we imagine that Mary and Joseph are being sent out into the night by some heartless Jewish innkeeper. And that's the way it's often portrayed. And make no mistake about it, there are some scary, some very dark reasons, right? People want to portray a Jewish innkeeper as greedy and cold, and he's going to send out this poor pregnant woman into the cold night. Hey, let's be careful about this. There's none of that in the gospel story. In fact, if you read the story in Luke, she gave birth while she was in Bethlehem. It's not like she was on her way to Bethlehem and they just got into the city and she needs to find a place to give birth. She's been in Bethlehem for a little while, right? According to the gospel of Luke. And that word there is really significant, kataluma. Now, let me just give you, I think, what is, now I want to explain, I'm not trying to just be like a iconoclast. I'm not telling you this just because I want to destroy your Christmas imagination. No, there's something at stake here that I think is also important from a theological perspective. Let me get to that. Well, the better translation of Luke 2:7 in my mind would be, There was no space. The Greek word there is topos. You're nodding your head. You're finishing your first semester of Greek, right? So we get the word topography, for example. There was no space, or there was no place, right? There was not the word for room, like, room 4, occupied. Room 7, occupied. There's no room in the inn, right? That's why I think that translation gets confusing to people. The word there is communicating the idea there was no space. There was no place for them. And then the word that is used is kataluma. There was no room for them in the room. See, the word that's used here, kataluma, occurs later in the Gospel of Luke. It's not in the Good Samaritan story. It's not Pendokian. It's not the word for in the story of the Good Samaritan. No, it's actually the same word that's used for the upper room. Okay, so if you go to Luke 22, Jesus is giving Peter and John directions as to how to prepare for the Passover. And he sends them into Jerusalem, and he says, you shall say to the master of the house, the teacher says to you, where is the guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples? And the word there that's translated guest room is the same word that's used in the Gospel of Luke in the infancy narrative there, kataluma, where I may eat the Passover with my disciples. And he shall show you a large upper room that is furnished, there prepare. And they went and they found everything as he has said to them, and they prepared the Passover. And it's in the upper room, of course, that Jesus takes the bread, he blesses it, he breaks it, he gives it to them, and he says, this is my body. Now, why is this all significant? In the infancy narrative, understand what's going on. They put him in the feeding trough because he can't be in the room. But once he's in the room, then he reveals that he's food. And so before he's in the room in his infancy, he's put where the food goes. And then later, when he's in the upper room, he announces that he is food. This is my body. So the manger is actually a Eucharistic image.
Wow.
And what Luke is doing is he's setting up the Last Supper story, so that when Jesus goes into the room, he's going to reveal himself to be the food that is already hinted at in the infancy story. And this is not Michael Barber's crazy, interpretation, eclectic interpretation. Never heard it before. Let me tell you something for the first time. And it's not that. No, this is church fathers. This is Cyril of Alexandria, for example. I have more quotations in my Christmas book on this. Whereas we were brutish in soul, by now approaching the manger, yes, his table, we find no longer feed, straw, but the bread from heaven, which is the body of life. The Eucharist is the manger. The altar is the manger for the church fathers. So it's a Eucharistic image. And when we have that translation, I think, of no room in the inn, we lose that connection with the upper room, and that weakens the Eucharistic imagery that I think is important in the passage. So there's no reference to them going out to a stable or something like that. And what's happening here is, in Palestinian homes in the first century, you would have one area where the family lived, and that's where the animals would be. And then you had another room that was private, had its own doorway, and that was the guest room, the kataluma. And so what's probably happening in the Gospel of Luke is they go to Bethlehem, and there's not enough space in them in that guest room to give birth. Maybe because it's small. Giving birth requires a lot of people. There's going to be, midwives and other people helping to deliver the child. Maybe there were already people staying in the guest room. They got there before Joseph and Mary arrived. But for whatever reason, they're not given the privilege of staying in a guest room. And once again, what the author is doing is emphasizing the humility of Christ and the humble circumstances, in particular, of his birth.
Claim number, 8. Shepherds were despised. I've heard this one a lot.
Yeah, let's just get through this one quickly. That's just nonsense. Okay. There's a lot of things that get said about shepherds, that they were seen as unclean.
Stinky.
No. Yeah. The greatest heroes in Israel's history were shepherds. Moses was a shepherd. David was a shepherd. So to claim that shepherds were looked down upon as unclean and despised, disreputable, it really doesn't hold up close. There are some selective readings of rabbinic passages that people will use to justify this, but there's really no support for it. So let's just move on. This is just another way people will try to create a picture of Judaism that's kind of heartless, right? They look down on people who are poor or marginalized. We'll talk about that later.